Hey y'all, Zach McDonald, your real estate agent here with Real Property Associates, and I want to spend some time today going over the offer making process. So if you're one of my existing clients, welcome. If you are somebody that's watching this video online and you're just trying to learn about the process and maybe find some strategies to making a successful offer, welcome as well. I'm going to, in this video, address the more generic, more of a broad brush over the different topics, and I might get a little more specific on the terms. And then in the next video, I will get into more of the tactics to winning a bidding war. So if you've made an offer before and you're familiar with the general process, then you can go ahead and skip this video. I hate saying that, but you can skip this video and go watch the next one. If you are new to the process, though, you want to make sure that you watch this video right now so that you're prepared to add on to that the strategies for winning a competitive offer. So let's talk about this here. And the big idea with making an offer is you want to find out what the seller's looking for. They'll advertise to you what the asking price is, but you want to figure out what the seller's looking for and what you're looking for ultimately and find an agreement. So what you're doing is you're making an offer to the seller, hopefully one that they'll accept, but there's going to be back and forth negotiation generally in a purchase and sale agreement or in an offer that you present to a seller. Now, as a real estate agent, I handle negotiations all the time, and if you're watching this and you're working with me, I will handle all these details for you, but we're going to have conversations about this, and so I want you to know, well, what are we actually doing? I want you to be educated so that you're comfortable and confident as we go through this process. The strategies, like I said, I'm going to get more into in the next video. So if you're watching this video and going, when are we going to get into the multiple offers part? That's going to be in the next one. But I want to start off just kind of on the first part, and this is the biggest piece in a real estate negotiation, and that's going to be the price. And to go in with this, people ask me, well, how much should I offer? And in Seattle, we're one of the hottest real estate markets in the country right now. Most homes are selling for at least the asking price or above. Now, again, it just depends on how long's the house been on the market for. Has it been on the market for a month, or has the house been on the market for 3 days? In a buyer's market, it's a market that's more favorable to a buyer. Typically, there's more price negotiation and prices are going down rather than upwards. In a seller's market, which is where we find ourselves in Seattle right now, the seller has the advantage in the negotiations, just meaning there's a lot less homes for sale, there's more buyers in the pool, so they're less motivated to negotiate on the price as much. So right now we find ourselves in a seller's market, so there isn't as much negotiation on the price. But if you're watching this video maybe a little bit down the line, maybe the market's changed a little bit. So the price is the biggest piece in the negotiation though. And there is flexibility. The seller is presenting an asking price. It's not a take it or leave it price. But you will find that's kind of what it feels like, at least the first few weeks a house is on the market in the Seattle area, at least right now. And then outside of the price, the other things we're going to be looking at in the offer are the terms and the contingencies. So some of the most important terms in a contract, and I'm not going to go into all the details, but I want to answer most of the pressing questions that you might have. And the first one is going to be earnest money. Now, earnest money is your good faith deposit. It's your down payment to your down payment. And it's not extra money that you pay, but it is money that you pay earlier on in the process. So once your offer is accepted by the seller and you have what's called mutual acceptance, that's when you both agree, you will have typically 2 to 3 days, depending on your deposit type, to deposit your earnest money. And this is money that the escrow company, and we'll come back to who the escrow company is here in a minute, they're going to hold on to this. I guess it could be a real estate firm too, so escrow company or a real estate firm will hold on to this money through the process. And at closing, another term we'll talk about later, that money is going to be credited towards your down payment, closing costs, etc. So it's not extra money, but it is, your earnest money is money that you pay earlier on in the process. And then after earnest money, we're going to be talking about the closing date. I think closing date's another big term. And again, like I said, I'm not going to cover all of them, but the closing date is going to be the date that, well, you get to become the owner. So the date is typically, I'd say 30 to 45 days out is a pretty normal time frame from the time that you have mutual acceptance until closing. And there's a bunch of stuff that happens in the between there. In a faster market, or in maybe some of the strategies we'll talk about in a little bit, sometimes it's better to close a little quicker, and maybe the seller's willing to negotiate a little bit more on the price. Or in a competitive situation, maybe that gives you a little bit of a leg up on the other buyers. So that's going to be another thing we'll talk about as far as the terms go. Those are just a couple of the main terms. There's lots of different terms that are included in the purchase and sale. And then the other thing that we'll want to talk about are contingencies. And I think this is the part where buyers really want to talk a little bit more about. And the contingencies are, I call them the buts in a contract. So the idea with the contingency is you're able to protect yourself in the event that a certain event happens in the future. So it's essentially an unforeseen event that happens, and you get to decide, okay, well, let's give you an example. So financing, if you have applied for a loan and for some reason you're not able to get a loan, that would be a type of contingency you can include in the contract. So a financing contingency would protect you in the event that a future event that's you're not going to be able to foresee it, but it could happen. A possible outcome is that they decline you for your loan, and now you're not able to purchase the home. And the purpose of the earnest money, which we just talked about, is actually to protect the seller in the event that you default on the contract. So they're going to take their house off the market. They're going to go ahead and stop advertising it to other people. They're going to go ahead and give you the shot to go ahead and purchase this house. They want to know that you're going to perform on this purchase. So for them, that's the reason that they want to see the earnest money. And so as a buyer, when you are giving your earnest money, what you can protect it with are these contingencies we're talking about. And so the financing is one of the main contingencies in the contract. The other main contingency that's kind of built into the financing contingency is an appraisal contingency. And the appraisal contingency protects you in the event that, well, the appraisal comes in lower than the asking price or the purchase price, on the contract. So in every contract, you've got your purchase price, and the bank is looking to protect their interests. They want to make sure that what you're purchasing is actually worth lending on. So a neutral third party will come out at the buyer's expense, typically, and evaluate the property. They'll come out, give a physical inspection typically, and then they'll do a comparative market analysis, a lot like what a real estate professional does in their analysis of a property. And they're going to come out and they're going to suggest a value for the house. And a lot of times it comes back at value is the term. That's at the purchase price. Sometimes it comes in a little bit more, and occasionally it does come in lower. And in the event that it comes in lower, this appraisal contingency protects you as a buyer and allows you to, if it comes in low, there's a couple different options. So you let the seller know, and it gives you the chance to either renegotiate the price down to what the appraised value is, or the seller could go ahead and get a reappraisal at their own expense. And the third option there would be to back out as the buyer if the seller's not willing to negotiate. So it's another opportunity to back out, and it's usually included in a financing contingency, but it can be separated out. But the biggest issue that typically comes up with financing, at least after you've gone through the pre-approval process, which I highly recommend, and we'll talk about more in the competitive offer, why that's so important. But the financing contingency is typically that main contingency. The other one that we'll come up against, or we will typically include, is the inspection contingency. And the inspection contingency, again, protects you as the home buyer in the event that there's something wrong with the house, maybe that you didn't know about or that you aren't prepared to take on financially. So the inspection contingency is typically 5 to 10 days, and this period of time allows you as the buyer to do some more due diligence. So you can hire a licensed home inspector to come in and evaluate the home. They're going to look at the systems and the structure of the house. They're going to provide you with their feedback on what they inspected, and it typically comes in a written report with details, photos, summaries, things like that, and advice for you as a home buyer. And then in the event that you're able to include an inspection contingency, this becomes a negotiating tool for you potentially as a home buyer. So let's say the inspection comes back and there's not any major issues. You can, as a buyer, just decide to go ahead and purchase the house. You can also, if there are things that you feel you would like the seller to take care of, or you would just like a monetary credit, maybe a reduction in the purchase price to offset some of these either issues with the house or defects with the house, that's an opportunity as well. And then if you as a buyer decide during this inspection period that you don't want to purchase the house anymore, or there are too many issues for you to be able to overcome, you can actually rescind your offer, and assuming you have this contingency for an inspection, you're actually able to back out of the purchase and retain this earnest money we were talking about. And the other piece with this inspection is I advise buyers to get what's called a sewer scope. And I think it's more important on an older house. So in Seattle, you have a lot of older houses built in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, and there's a lot more potential that the sewer line connecting out to the sewer main has issues. And as a home buyer, that's actually a responsibility. And so you can't see it from the road, but there could be many different potential issues with that. So what a sewer scope is they'll actually run a camera down the sewer line. So it's essentially a colonoscopy for a house. So if you've never seen a colonoscopy, I guess you can have your first one be for your house. And I don't watch colonoscopies for fun, by the way. The purpose here, though, is just to identify any issues with the sewer line. And again, it's more important for an older house, but sometimes it's still important on a new construction house. I've heard stories, I haven't witnessed it myself, but I've heard stories where the new construction house, brand new, and they accidentally fill in the sewer line with concrete while they're finishing it up. Well, that's a bummer. So in that event, the builder actually had to go back and repair the sewer lines for multiple owners. So it was actually a big win for multiple people that didn't do sewer scopes. So it's definitely a recommendation. Again, it's not something you have to do, but it could potentially protect you from 5, 10, 15 grand at work. The other thing with inspection, I'll just mention this really quick. There's oftentimes in a competitive situation, you'll actually do what's called a pre-inspection. So you will do your inspection before making your offer. And the purpose of that is to make your offer stronger to the seller, but also still give you the information you need to make an informed decision on the purchase. In that situation, I'll go into that a little bit more in the competitive offer video, but just keep that in the back of your mind. If there's going to be multiple offers, we're probably going to be doing this inspection process a little bit differently and maybe a little bit earlier. A few other terms that I mentioned, and I want to come back to now, this is the title and escrow company. So title company is, we'll start with this. A car has a title and a house has a title. So if you've purchased a car before, you're going to take possession of the car and also possession of the title. And what the title does is it shows ownership of the vehicle, and the same thing is with a house. The title shows ownership of the house. So when you purchase a house, you're taking possession of the title, and one of the things you want to make sure is that the title is clean and that it's clear and it doesn't have any issues. And so what the title company does is they provide a couple different things. They will do research up front to make sure that there are no what's called clouds on the title or defects in the title. Essentially what they're looking for are things like unpaid taxes or maybe a lien on the property. That's if you had somebody do work on your house, let's say you had your roof replaced or you did some major renovations, the contractor could come back to you if you haven't paid that and put a lien on your house saying, hey, this bill needs to get paid if this house is ever sold off. The most common ones are going to be from a lender. So if you get a mortgage on your house, they're going to have a lien on your house. And you'll also see tax liens. Those are the two most common. The mortgage is primarily there on most sales. So that's just something that they'll know, and they'll make sure that they're all paid off. So this title company is going to, first of all, research and then investigate and say, hey, these are These are still liens that need to get paid off and make sure they're paid off before closing. They're going to investigate the owner, make sure there's not any other legal troubles maybe. And then they're also going to insure the property. So they're going to provide an insurance in case of some hidden event that they weren't even aware of and you weren't aware of, and they'll actually pay for it. So for example, our company purchased a home, and a division that does remodels, and the title company did their research, said it was good to go, and then a couple weeks later after they purchased it, a contractor came to them and said, hey, you owe us 50 grand. We had a lien on this property, and the title company didn't find it. And so they actually were the ones on the hook to pay this contractor off, not the company. So that's the purpose of the title insurance. The escrow company is in charge of closing. So there's a couple of metaphors. You could talk about baseball if you're a baseball fan. There's a pitcher that comes in at the end, and they're in charge of getting the game closed. They're in charge of pitching the last inning, making sure that there's no more runs scored. You have another analogy maybe as a referee in a sporting match. You're making sure everybody's playing according to the rules. The escrow officer or closer in this situation is going to be handling the contract and the finances. So they're going to make sure that everybody's meeting their contractual obligations, and then also paying the money that they're owed. So they're going to be dealing with the utility companies, and they're going to be dealing with the lenders, and they're going to be dealing with buyers and sellers. And they're just a neutral, unbiased third party in the middle, making sure that all the little pieces are coming together and that money's going where it's supposed to go in the end. So they're the ones that'll hold on to that earnest money. And I don't think I mentioned this earlier, and I meant to, but earnest money is typically 2 to 3% of the purchase price. Is typically a strong earnest money amount. You can pay up to 5% in an earnest money deposit, but that's the most that the seller is actually allowed to keep for damages. So most buyers end up being in that 2 to 3%, specifically in a competitive situation. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. There's a few other things I think that are helpful to talk about. The first one is if you're buying a condo or a house maybe in a homeowners association, you can include a contingency that's for reviewing the HOA rules, or they call them CC&Rs, or the resale certificate. So if you're buying a condo, it actually comes with a disclosure that tells you all about the condo. It's going to give you the bylaws, the CC&Rs. You're going to get to see the budget. You're going to get to see if they have any upcoming assessments to the building, what the HOA dues cover, things like that. So it essentially allows you to do your due diligence on that condo. And if you're purchasing a house with an HOA, you're still going to get to review some of that information, but you would have to include that in the contract. So a lot of times we try to get this information up front, specifically if it's competitive, so that you as the buyer can get all that information and read through it before making your offer, rather than including that as a contingency. But if there's no other offers on the table, or if it's been a few weeks, those are contingencies we can include that allow you as the buyer just extra time to continue to do due diligence, which is nice. And then the other piece of the contract I want to talk about are the disclosures. And so there's typically a few disclosures that are part of the contract. The first one is a seller disclosure form. And this disclosure is a disclosure to you as the buyer from the seller, just describing the house. It's a 6-page form. It's very detailed, and it's a yes, no, don't know, not applicable form. And they're going to go through, and they're going to essentially go through the whole entire house. And they're going to make known to you defects about the house that maybe aren't obvious to you right away and aren't as easily discoverable. Things that maybe are hidden, like that damaged floorboard underneath the rug, things like that. So you'll see things like cracks in the chimney, or failing mortar on the chimney, or you might see water damage to the hardwoods underneath the sink, things like that. So they're going to tell you all the things that maybe aren't quite as obvious. They might not say there's chipped paint in the kitchen, but they'll make sure that you're aware of things that might not be as obvious. Now, this is a disclosure to you, and typically what happens then is you have a couple options. You're able to just acknowledge receipt of that, and then you still have a few days to review it after receipt. Typically in a competitive situation, what you'll do is you will review that, read all that information, and then you have the right to waive your right to back out on based on the disclosure. So based on what they've given you. You get to see all that information and then make a decision. Do I want to purchase this house or not? It usually doesn't make sense in a competitive situation to just say, yeah, I've received it, I want to continue to review. It makes your offer not as strong in the eyes of the seller. And then you can also just outright waive your right to even see a disclosure, but that doesn't happen very often. Usually you want to see that disclosure. The interesting thing with the seller disclosure too is that if something new comes to light later on, let's say let's say maybe the fence line's in the wrong spot and the neighbor comes to you and you get into an issue. I had this happen on a sale recently where, well, I guess it was a little longer than recently, 6-7 months ago now. The next door neighbor came to the owner of the property that my buyers were purchasing and said, hey, the fence is actually in the wrong spot and I have a survey to prove it. And they were right there. It was 2-3 feet over the line. And in that case, now that's a new issue that needs to get resolved prior to closing, right? And so we were able to get that moved. It wasn't a problem for the buyer. Everything worked out in the end. But that would have been a new thing, right? That the buyer needs, or the seller needs to disclose, and would be an opportunity for the new buyer to say, whoa, hey, wait a minute, this is a problem. And then the other disclosure is going to be a lead-based paint disclosure. So any home built before 1978 could and might have had lead-based paints used in the house, probably more commonly in a lot older homes, talking about 1910s, 1920s. Typically the remedy is to paint over it. That's what most people do. And so a lot of these older houses have been painted over 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times. The other remedy, of course, would be to scrape it all off and repaint it. But the majority of them are just painted over, and that's one of the common remedies. So most people, when they get this, don't really have a knowledge of any lead-based paint. So you most commonly and rarely, if ever, do you see somebody say, yes, I know there's lead-based paint in this house. I've had it tested. Most of the time they say, I don't know. And so in that instance, you as the buyer can elect to test the house for lead-based paint. So if you have little kids or animals that you're concerned about being exposed to lead, that's an option to you. Like I said, again, most of these homes have been painted over multiple times, and so it's not really something that you're going to come in contact with. But again, it's an option that you have. In a competitive situation, we'll talk about this more, but typically buyers don't do a lead-based inspection. I've actually never had a client do a lead-based inspection, but I have seen it from other buyers when they make an offer. But in competitive situations, again, it's just another thing that a seller doesn't necessarily want to deal with. Before we wrap this up and get into the competitive offers, I want to talk about a couple other common questions I get. So the first one is just how much should I offer? And I talked about the price a little bit up front, but really the offer price comes down to you as the buyer. What's this house worth to you? And as a real estate professional, people ask me a lot on the opposite side when they're a seller, hey, how much is my house worth, right? So you have a buyer asking how much should I offer, and a seller, how much is my house worth? And really, there's a range. And ultimately, a house is worth what somebody's willing to pay for it. So as a buyer, you need to figure out, okay, how much is this house worth to me? And we can always do some due diligence up front and see, okay, well, what have comparable homes sold for in the neighborhood? And that would be part of a listing agent's due diligence. And so as a buyer's agent, we can do some due diligence there as well. Again, in those competitive situations, if there's going to be 5 to 10 offers, there's a lot, it's a different conversation, I guess. And that brings me to this next question. What's an escalation clause? A lot of buyers ask me about that. Well, I've heard this thing about an escalation clause. An escalation clause allows you to essentially pick a higher price than the asking price generally. So you offer the asking price and it allows you to pick a walkaway point. And it's almost like a silent auction. I hate that word, but maybe if you're familiar with eBay, there's a tool on eBay where you can make a bid and then say, I'm willing to pay up to this price. I'm willing to pay up to $500, but I want to start my bid at $100. And then I'd like to pay $5 more than the next offer, the next bid up to this $500 period. And so essentially what this escalation clause allows you to do is pick your walkaway point, and then you're going to beat, you're going to pay a little bit more than this other, whatever competing offers there are until you reach your cap. And so, for example, if you offered $500,000 in the house, and so did somebody else, and then you included an escalation clause that said, I'm willing to pay up to $550,000 for this house, and I'd like to pay, this is the increment, amount. I'd like to pay $5,000 more than that other offer up to my cap of $550. And then somebody else says, you know what, I'll pay $525 for this house. Well, your offer would then, with that escalation clause, add $5,000 to the price of their offer, and now your offer would become $530,000. So you're essentially just escalating your offer above that other offer until you reach your cap. I have seen, again, I haven't seen this with my own eyes, but I've heard stories of buyers that say no limit on their escalation clause, which is absolutely crazy, up to infinity. And that's the good old I'm richer than you are, I'm going to get this house. And I think that's foolish. So most people pick a walkaway point, right? That makes sense to them. And we can talk about this a little bit more in the next video about how to make a competitive offer and the psychology behind that. But the escalation clause is a great tool in those multiple offer situations, but we don't always include it. Sometimes it's not an applicable tool, especially if there's not other offers on the table. The other thing that I get asked, and I'll have a couple more questions here, when can I back out of the purchase? And I mentioned the inspection contingency earlier, and that's typically your main way to back out during the purchase. You have the HOA review period, so if you find something that's troubling or problematic to you, you're able to back out of the purchase. But the main contingency that people back out on during a purchase is that inspection period. So if you have a 5-day inspection period, during that period, if you don't like the house, or you change your mind, or you decide you don't want to buy a house altogether, you have the opportunity to, during that period, rescind your offer and maintain your earnest money. Now, you can back out whenever you want, but, well, yeah, generally you can, but you would be forfeiting your earnest money, which is that good faith deposit that you're making. So if you don't have any reason to back out and you decide you want to back out, you're going to owe the seller whatever that earnest money is, generally speaking. So the last question I want to address is that when do I get my keys question. And you get your keys on the day of closing. And the day of closing, I mentioned earlier, is typically 30 to 45 days after you get under contract with a seller here with your offer. After you've closed, it's typically by 9 p.m. typically the house it's what's called recorded. It gets recorded with the county, so the deed gets recorded with the county, and so does the mortgage deed of trust is what they call it. That's the new lien on the house in your name. And those get recorded, and then the money gets exchanged on that day. We call it funding and recording. And then at the end of that period, we close, and you get to get your keys as the buyer. So it's either later that day or the next day would be when you'd be able to pick up your keys. So this is a semi-brief overview of how to make an offer, just generally, so you have a more broad picture of the process. Again, there's little pieces that I may have skipped over. It's not exhaustive, but I do have some notes in front of me, so hopefully you got a good idea of what it looks like to make an offer. If you're watching this and you're thinking about making an offer, or you're curious about learning more about your own situation and how to go about buying a house, I'd love to be a resource for you and sit down and talk more about your individual situation. So please feel free to reach out to me in one of the contact methods below, or send me a private message if you're watching this, maybe on Facebook or something like that. The next video, we're going to get more into how to win and write a competitive offer, and then how to beat other offers. So stay tuned, and if you just watch this one, please watch the next one, because I think you'll find some good value there.